smooth and it's life or death. Life is not in the past. Get blown right past. Coming out the night at the speed of light. Only the hard and the strong can achieve the high.
Just packed up a real money load and it's coming your way. Look for Rogers on the side of the truck. Don't forget my share of the deal.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the Danikport channel. Please remember to subscribe and hit that like button if you enjoy the content. Today we are going to be discussing the movie The Fast and the Furious from 2001. The neon haze of Los Angeles illuminated the world of street racing, a realm where speed was currency and loyalty was everything. At the heart of this scene was Dominic Toretto, a man whose mechanical genius was matched only by his fierce dedication to his chosen family. Dom, the proprietor of a humble garage and the undisputed king of the illegal midnight runs, carried the weight of a complex past, perhaps one involving an almost obsessive need for control, manifested in the precision of his vintage muscle cars, a trait possibly honed from years spent meticulously rebuilding engines where every spark and torque mattered. His ambition wasn't about riches, it was about respect and the pure, unfiltered thrill of the drive. Then enters Brian O'Connor, a fresh-faced, undercover cop from the LAPD, sent to infiltrate Dom's tight-knit circle. Brian, though initially posing as a skilled but slightly naive newcomer, eager to prove himself, possessed a raw, innate talent behind the wheel. He was a natural, perhaps showing early signs of the disciplined focus that would later define his career navigating the treacherous waters of law enforcement and high-stakes operations. His initial mission was simple: find out who was behind the string of high-tech truck hijackings that were plaguing the highways. Brian quickly submerged himself into Dom's world, drawn in by the adrenaline and, surprisingly, by the genuine camaraderie. He met Mia Toretto, Dom's sister, a woman who possessed the quiet strength of someone who understood the danger inherent in her brother's life, but chose to stand by him, often serving as the emotional anchor of their group. As Brian spent more time with them, his professional objective began to blur with a growing personal connection. He found himself admiring Dom's unwavering code of honor, a stark contrast to the bureaucracy he served. The tension mounted as Brian got closer to solving the case, all while constantly dodging exposure. He participated in increasingly dangerous races, showcasing a growing confidence that bordered on recklessness, the very recklessness that often defines those who find their true calling in unexpected places. Dom, meanwhile, continued his meticulous planning for the next big score, the hijacked goods proving to be essential components for high-end electronics, hinting at a sophistication beyond simple theft. The inevitable collision came. Brian's true identity was revealed, shattering the trust he had painstakingly built. Dom, feeling the deep sting of betrayal, a familiar ache for someone who valued trust above all else, confronted him. This confrontation wasn't just about the law versus the criminal. It was about a personal bond severed by deception. The climax unfolded during a final desperate race. It wasn't about winning the prize money anymore. It was about survival and defining loyalties. Brian, having chosen his own path rather than simply following orders, made a pivotal choice. When Dom found himself in imminent danger, cornered by a rival crew, Brian intervened, using his police training not to arrest, but to protect. The film closes on an emotional yet open note. Dom, acknowledging Brian's ultimate act of loyalty, allows him to walk away clean after their final furious drive. Brian, now stripped of his badge, but armed with a profound understanding of the street ethos, is left to forge a new path, one that forever balances the drive for justice with the pull of an unexpected brotherhood forged at 200 miles per hour. He didn't just catch a criminal, he found a different kind of family. The humid Los Angeles air hung heavy with the smell of burnt rubber and high-octane fuel, the soundtrack to Dominic Toretto's existence. Dom wasn't just a mechanic, he was a curator of raw American power, treating V8 engines with the reverence most men reserve for fine art. His entire demeanor suggested a man constantly bracing for impact, his loyalty fiercely guarded, forged in the crucible of a traumatic childhood that had taught him the harsh reality. Only blood, or the family you choose, truly has your back. His careful, almost ritualistic approach to modding cars mirrored a deep-seated need to control the chaos in his life. Brian O'Connor, the undercover operative, was initially a polished, almost painfully neat veneer over a genuinely competitive spirit. He possessed that easy adaptability required for deep cover work, a quality that would later propel him into federal agencies, where blending in and assessing threats became second nature. Yet, underneath the standard issue cop demeanor, Brian harbored a profound respect for genuine skill, something he witnessed firsthand every time Dom unleashed the fury of his charger on the asphalt. He was observing a culture, yes, but also recognizing an untamed artistry. The introduction of Mia was crucial. She was the quiet epicenter of Dom's volatile world. Her presence provided the necessary counterbalance, a gentle warmth that made Dom's world seem momentarily survivable, even desirable, to Brian. Brian's attempts to woo her were genuine, an unexpected side effect of the infiltration. He started seeing the world not through the narrow lens of an arrest report, but through the prism of shared moments. Late-night barbecues, shared silence over engine noise, the unspoken understanding among people living perpetually on the edge. The actual heists themselves were breathtaking displays of synchronized brutality. The way Dom's crew would swarm a semi-truck, using precision driving to strip it clean of DVD players and electronics, revealed a planning capability far exceeding common street thugs. It spoke of high organization, a parallel economy thriving beneath the surface of respectable society. Brian's failure to immediately identify the ringleader wasn't due to incompetence, but to the sheer magnetism of Dom's leadership. Everyone was fiercely protective of the operation and their boss. The discovery of Brian's true allegiance was devastating, less a successful police bust and more a catastrophic personal failure for everyone involved. For Dom, the betrayal cut deeper than any legal jeopardy. It questioned the very foundation of his chosen existence. The ensuing confrontation was raw, stripped bare of the noise of engines and the glare of neon. It was a primal clash between two men who understood velocity, but who applied it to radically different concepts of duty. The final race was the necessary catharsis. It wasn't merely a race to the finish line. It was a desperate bid for reconciliation and self-definition for both men. When Dom found himself pinned down, not by the police, though they were surely closing in, but by the very violence inherent in the criminal life he embraced, Brian made his defining move. He used his police training, the very tools meant to destroy Dom's world, to save his life. This wasn't abandoning the law. It was prioritizing a higher, more immediate code of honor. In that moment, Brian confirmed that the bonds forged under pressure were more real to him than any desk assignment. Letting Dom go was an acknowledgement that some men, driven by an almost elemental need for freedom and family, cannot be caged by procedure, leaving Brian to navigate the lonely stretch of road where his two lives irrevocably merged. The garage itself felt like a sanctuary, the scent of oil and old metal thick in the air, a tangible atmosphere that Brian O'Connor inhaled deeply, trying to process the dichotomy of the Toretto existence. Dom's garage wasn't just a business, it was a staging ground for rebellion, a place where societal rules were meticulously ignored in favor of mechanical perfection. Dom's intensity wasn't mere showmanship, it was the result of witnessing his own father's fatal accident on the track years prior, an event that solidified his belief that control was the only antidote to inevitable tragedy. This singular focus fueled his empire. Brian, the methodical investigator, found his notebook entries becoming less about quantifiable evidence and more about behavioral observations. He noted the way Letty, one of Dom's core crew, looked at him, a fierce, protective gaze that spoke volumes about shared hardship and unspoken survival pacts. Letty, with her own history of hard living and street smarts, embodied the resilience Dom demanded of his people. Brian realized his role as an agent was becoming parasitic. He was taking genuine connection without offering truth in return, a situation that began to grate against his own nascent sense of fairness. The tension within the group was always one misplaced word away from snapping. When Brian first engaged in the street races, his performance was initially calculated, designed to impress without revealing his superior training. However, the sheer thrill of pushing a machine to its absolute limit, the G-forces flattening his chest, the immediate feedback loop between man and machine, began to genuinely awaken the competitor in him. He wasn't just faking passion, he was finding an authentic, if illicit, passion. This internal conflict was etched on his face during tense moments, a brief flicker of the honest cop momentarily overridden by the exhilarated racer. The reveal of Brian's identity, orchestrated by circumstances perhaps inevitable given the high stakes of the truck raids, felt like a sudden, violent deceleration. The betrayal was visualized in the sudden coldness in Dom's eyes, a look Brian understood instinctively. It was the look of a man whose trust, once broken, was not easily repaired. For Dom, this act was an unforgivable trespass into the sanctity of his family unit, a violation far worse than any robbery charge. The final showdown wasn't scripted by police procedure. It was governed by the unwritten laws of the asphalt. When Dom was cornered, not by a rival driver, but by the chaotic fallout of his own dangerous life, Brian's decision was instantaneous, bypassing departmental protocol entirely. Using his cruiser, the very symbol of the authority he represented, to block the path of danger for Dom was a powerful, silent abdication of his former life. The subsequent moments, the shared look between the two men as Dom sped away, knowing he was given a reprieve born not of legal loophole, but of profound respect, encapsulated the film's core theme. Some connections transcend jurisdiction. Brian, left standing amidst the wreckage, was no longer just an officer. He was a man who had chosen sides based on character rather than badge, embracing a future where the line between the pursuer and the pursued was permanently blurred by the exhaust fumes of shared experience. The subsequent silence in the wake of Dom's escape was deafening, settling over Brian like a physical weight. He was a man officially suspended, unofficially exiled, standing in the harsh glare of the aftermath. His career, built upon a foundation of unwavering adherence to the written law, now lay in tatters, replaced by a fragile but fiercely earned honor among thieves, or rather, among brothers. The cruiser, the tool of his former trade, sat slightly dented, a testament to the cost of his decision. He looked down at the keys in his hand, the metal suddenly feeling alien, heavy with responsibility for choices made in the heat of adrenaline. Brian's immediate future was murky, an uncharted highway stretching out before him, but the emotional clarity was undeniable. He had chased the trucks, but he had caught something far more valuable: authenticity. He walked away from the scene, not towards the precinct, but towards the lingering scent of gasoline, understanding that the rigid structure of the LAPD could no longer contain a man who had learned the true meaning of loyalty at high speed. He knew that Dom, wherever he drove to escape the immediate heat, would operate under the same fundamental principle: family first, consequences later. The decision to let Dom go was not a failure of police work. It was a profound success in human connection. It suggested that Brian, perhaps reflecting the latent rebelliousness that often shadows the most disciplined minds, recognized that sometimes the only way to truly uphold justice was to bend the rules until they broke, creating space for mercy. He had seen the desperation and the code that bound Toretto's crew, recognizing in them a form of structure, albeit an illegal one, that strangely mirrored the dedication he admired in any elite unit. He had stepped off the grid, exchanging the safety of a bureaucracy for the dangerous yet undeniably vibrant reality of the street ethos. The open road, now his only affiliation, promised continued challenges, but for the first time, Brian felt he was driving toward a life that truly engaged his instincts, rather than merely satisfying an assignment. The dust settled slowly on the stretch of road where the final confrontation had taken place, leaving behind a landscape momentarily scarred by adrenaline and fractured trust. Brian O'Connor stood there, feeling the hollowness of his badge, a symbol now stripped of its inherent authority over him. The raw, visceral thrill of that last drive with Dom lingered, a phantom vibration in his hands that no standard-issue steering wheel could ever replicate. This new reality, stripped bare of paperwork and departmental oversight, demanded a different kind of internal navigation. He had always been a man focused on trajectory and precise execution, traits that made him an excellent undercover agent. Yet those same traits now made him acutely aware of the chasm between the man he was supposed to be and the man he had become. He realized that his admiration for Dom wasn't just about car modifications. It was about Dom's ability to curate his own existence, to build a fortress of loyalty that the outside world, with all its regulations and compromises, could never penetrate. For Brian, the precinct had always represented order, but Dom's world, chaotic as it was, represented purpose. This shift in perspective was deeply unsettling, yet profoundly liberating. He looked toward the direction Dom had vanished, not with the intention of a manhunt, but with a quiet sense of understanding, the kind of understanding that requires shared trauma and near-death experiences to cement. The memory of Mia's conflicted gaze, caught between her brother's safety and her burgeoning affection for Brian, haunted him most clearly. She represented the domesticity and genuine warmth he had briefly accessed, a glimpse of a normal life that was now likely inaccessible to him, tainted by his initial deception. He knew that any future path he took would have to reconcile this duality. The inherent need for structure battling the undeniable allure of freedom, found only in living outside the lines. Brian O'Connor was now an anomaly, a former lawman who understood the criminal better than the criminals understood themselves, armed with street knowledge and an unshakable, albeit complicated debt to the man who had shown him what it meant to truly drive. He walked away from the abandoned patrol car, not running from the law, but stepping purposefully into the unknown territory where his new allegiances and his true talents would finally find their proper application. The silence following Dom's hurried departure was not the quiet of resolution, but the breathless pause before the next inevitable storm. Brian felt the weight of his choices settle into his bones, heavier than any police vest he'd ever worn. He was adrift, a vessel cut loose from its charted course, yet strangely invigorated by the open sea. The internal calculus that had always governed his actions, risk versus reward, evidence versus conclusion, was now dominated by a singular overriding variable: the Toretto Code. He understood with chilling clarity that for Dom, the crime was secondary to the camaraderie. The pursuit of material goods was merely a byproduct of the essential human need for belonging. Brian's mechanical aptitude, once a carefully cultivated hobby to pass the monotonous hours of surveillance, now felt essential. It was a common language he shared with Dom's world, a tangible skill that offered immediate relevance outside the abstract realm of procedure manuals. He imagined Dom, already miles away, perhaps already tinkering, finding solace in the predictable perfection of internal combustion, already planning the next iteration of his life on the move. This life, Brian realized, was intrinsically linked to speed. Standing still meant being caught, both legally and emotionally. His initial admiration for Dom had morphed into a deep, perhaps even familial respect. Dom, despite his criminal enterprise, operated with an integrity that many career officers lacked. He never compromised the safety of his crew for personal gain, a stark contrast to the political maneuvering Brian had witnessed within the LAPD hierarchy. This understanding didn't absolve Dom, but it complicated Brian's internal narrative significantly. He wasn't just letting a fugitive go, he was preserving a rare, albeit dangerous, form of constructed family. Walking away from the cruiser symbolized a definitive break. That car represented the predictable, the prosecutable, the expected narrative. Brian craved the unpredictable reality he'd tasted in Dom's garage, the raw, unvarnished honesty of people fighting for their space in a world that marginalized them. He wasn't sure if he would ever see Dom or Mia again, but the imprint of their shared velocity remained. It was the realization that true competence wasn't about holding the right title, but about knowing how to handle pressure when the speedometer needle was buried in the red. Brian O'Connor was now a student of the shadows, possessing a skill set lethal to his former employers, and he knew, with a certainty forged in illegal streetlights, that his career in law enforcement, as he knew it, was over. He was now operating on instinct, propelled by the promise of the open road and the ghosts of the brotherhood he chose to save. The city lights of Los Angeles, which once seemed to promise opportunity, now felt like the blinking eyes of an unblinking adversary. Brian, shedding the last vestiges of his undercover persona, found a strange comfort in anonymity. He was no longer the eager, slightly clumsy rookie. The baptism by fire in the Toretto orbit had forged something harder, something pragmatic. His discipline, once channeled into paperwork and observation posts, was now reserved for self-preservation. He knew the streets were watching, and worse, the police force he abandoned was surely dissecting his every move, looking for the weak point in his sudden dramatic shift in allegiance. He thought of Dom's battered, yet meticulously maintained Dodge Charger, a machine that was more an extension of his will than a mere vehicle. That car represented everything Brian was now drawn to, raw power, untamed by regulation. Brian's own nascent talent for hot wiring and diagnostics, skills he'd practiced out of necessity during his infiltration, suddenly seemed like the only viable career path forward. The technical knowledge he possessed made him valuable in the underground circuits, a currency far more reliable than a paycheck signed by the state. The emotional toll was the most persistent drag. He missed the uncomplicated trust of Mia, the shared glances over a wrench or under the hood. He had traded genuine intimacy for the manufactured intensity of a sting operation, and now, having tasted the real thing, the sterility of police life was unbearable. He had chased the thrill of the bust, but found the true high in the shared risk, the collective breath held just before the launch. Brian's journey forward wasn't about becoming a criminal in the mold of Toretto. It was about rejecting the false morality of bureaucracy. He carried the ghost of Dom's code, a loyalty that superseded legal statute, and integrated it with his own inherent sense of fairness. He was walking the tightrope between two worlds, fully aware that one wrong step would send him plummeting into irrelevance, or worse, incarceration. He saw the future not as a straight, paved road, but as a series of high-speed evasions, where his skill set would be deployed not to uphold a system he no longer believed in, but to protect the fragile ecosystem of chosen family he had inadvertently discovered on the asphalt. The engine of his future was running, idling low, waiting for the perfect moment to roar. The first few weeks of his self-imposed exile were characterized by a low-level, constant paranoia, the kind that makes a man check his rearview mirror every 30 seconds, even when parked. Brian had traded the structured surveillance of police work for the self-surveillance required to simply disappear. He sold his standard-issue sedan, a bland, dependable machine, for cash, buying a nondescript import, something fast but utterly forgettable, a rolling testament to his new philosophy. Blend in, move fast, leave no traceable digital footprint. He gravitated toward the edges of the city, places where the neon faded into genuine darkness, searching for familiar echoes of the street racing culture he had so recently tried to dismantle. He found himself drawn to the quieter garages, the unofficial meccas where mechanics tinkered late into the night, not for glory under stadium lights, but for the necessity of keeping their battered machines alive. Here, his skills were currency, and his silence was respected. He didn't boast about his past. He simply fixed problems others couldn't touch, earning nods of approval that felt far more validating than any commendation from internal affairs. His interaction with the underground became a delicate dance. He was a known quantity, the cop who let Toretto walk, which earned him a measure of cautious respect from the criminal element, a dangerous reputation in some circles, but a sign of integrity in others. He learned to listen more than he spoke, absorbing the unspoken rules of this shadow economy. He saw the desperation underpinning the bravado. These weren't just adrenaline junkies. They were people carving out an existence where the system had already judged them unworthy. The ache for Mia remained a persistent hum beneath the surface noise of his new life. She represented the possibility of normalcy, the integration of his two warring halves. He knew reaching out would be reckless, an invitation for trouble to find both of them. Yet the isolation was starting to press in. He realized that Dom's definition of family wasn't just about loyalty under duress. It was about shared vulnerability, something Brian had only experienced fleetingly before his cover was blown. Now, Brian had to rebuild that vulnerability from scratch, one honest repair and one shared, silent coffee break at a time, navigating a world where every alliance was provisional and every engine needed a final perfect tune-up before it could truly be trusted. The thin veneer of anonymity Brian had constructed began to feel less like a protective layer and more like a self-imposed cage. He moved through the fringes of the car scene like a ghost, recognized just enough to earn entry to the illicit meets, but remaining distant enough to avoid deep entanglement. His mechanical work was becoming more specialized. He wasn't just fixing cars anymore. He was optimizing them for a life lived constantly on the edge of legality, tuning engines for quick escapes rather than showmanship. This technical refinement was a tribute, perhaps subconscious, to the uncompromising standards Dom had set. He often found himself lingering near the coastal highways, the vast, indifferent ocean mirroring the emptiness that had settled in the space where his career certainty used to be. He'd replay the moments leading up to his reveal, searching for the precise instant where the line between observer and participant blurred irreparably. It wasn't the thrill of the chase that had corrupted him. It was the authenticity of the chase, the genuine commitment of Dom and his crew to one another that resonated with a deeper, unmet need within Brian. He understood now that Dom's life wasn't just about defying authority. It was about defining his own jurisdiction. The few brief, coded interactions he allowed himself with the old racing crowd confirmed his fears. Dom was moving, always moving, a phantom presence always one step ahead of any genuine dragnet. This perpetual evasion resonated with Brian. He too was now perpetually evading the structure he once embodied. He recognized that true freedom in this subculture wasn't the absence of rules, but the choice of which rules to adhere to. Brian's internal conflict was manifesting physically. His sleep was restless, punctuated by the imagined screech of tires and the hollow sound of a door slamming shut on a promise. He carried the heavy responsibility of his choices like ballast. He knew that if he ever re-entered the straight world, the shadow of Dom would follow, making him either the department's greatest asset or their most dangerous liability. For now, however, the road called to the competent mechanic, the skilled driver who understood the language of high performance better than anyone wearing a badge could. He was living proof that sometimes the greatest loyalty one could show was to the truth discovered under duress, even if that truth led one entirely off the map. The necessity of constant motion became Brian's new doctrine. He understood that in the world he now inhabited, stasis was equivalent to surrender. His days were spent hunting down rare parts or performing complex diagnostics for contacts who paid in untraceable cash, always working under the pale, flickering lights of back-alley garages, far from the pristine, brightly lit showrooms he once inhabited as a cop. This physical movement was a direct reflection of his psychological state, perpetually unsettled, yet always progressing along a self-defined trajectory. He developed a near-obsessive attention to detail in his mechanical work, a hyper-focus that pushed back the encroaching loneliness. Every weld, every timed ignition sequence was a small act of defiance against the chaos he had previously tried to contain through regulations. He wasn't just building speed, he was building self-sufficiency. He'd catch his reflection in polished chrome, a man who looked capable, weathered, and utterly disconnected from the clean-cut image of the fresh-faced officer who first stepped into the Toretto garage. That past self seemed almost fictional now. The memory of Dom's parting look, a complex mixture of grudging respect and absolute finality, was a constant internal reference point. It was a lesson in boundaries. Dom had respected Brian's choice to save him, but he had also made it clear that the choice had consequences for their relationship. There would be no casual calls, no chance encounters. Their paths had diverged permanently, marked by the chasm of Brian's initial deception. Yet the magnetic pull toward Mia remained an unspoken tether. Brian often found himself analyzing patterns in regional police scanner chatter, not to evade capture for himself, but in the faint, desperate hope of ensuring that Dom and the crew were staying ahead of any serious heat. This was an unhealthy habit, an addiction to caring for people he was legally obligated to apprehend, and he knew it. It was the cost of finding an identity that finally felt earned, even if it was entirely illicit. He was a man defined by paradox, a lawbreaker seeking justice, a loner who craved the very connection he couldn't sustain. His future was an engine running rich, powerful, loud, and burning fuel far too quickly, but moving forward nonetheless. The air in the makeshift workshops where Brian now plied his trade was perpetually thick with the metallic tang of oil and the faint, acrid smell of desperation. He worked long hours, his hands permanently stained, embracing the grime as a badge of his new reality. This labor was meditative, a way to keep the complex machinery of his regret from seizing up entirely. He found a peculiar kinship with the older mechanics, men who understood that sometimes the only way to keep a fragile machine, or a fragile life, running was through constant hands-on intervention, ignoring the official schematics. His reputation grew quietly. He was the guy who could coax impossible performance out of temperamental hardware, a man who didn't ask too many questions as long as the cash was clean. This professional competence provided a necessary buffer against the emotional isolation. He'd catch himself sketching out potential modifications for Dom's Charger in the margins of his service notes, an involuntary homage to the man who taught him the limits of metal and speed. It was a form of silent communication, an acknowledgement that even across the divide of betrayal and law, their shared language remained the pursuit of absolute mechanical perfection. The decision to walk away from his badge had left an echoing void where purpose used to reside. Brian now had to construct his own purpose from the debris of his former life. He understood that Dom operated on a high-stakes emotional ledger, always balancing debt and loyalty, and Brian now owed an unpayable debt to the very people he was supposed to neutralize. This realization fueled a new kind of vigilance. He watched the news not for departmental success stories, but for any mention of the high-profile hijackings that might lead authorities back to the Toretto Circle. He knew Mia was the weak link, the emotional tether that could drag him back into the spotlight, or conversely, offer him a path toward some semblance of normalcy. But to involve her now would be to invite the structure he fled to consume the last fragile piece of the family he accidentally found. He remained a shadow, a hyper-competent operative adrift, perfectly capable of dismantling any system, but utterly incapable of building a stable life within one. His freedom was exhilarating, but it was purchased at the steep price of constant vigilance and the profound, constant awareness that he was living on borrowed time, waiting for the moment when the road he chose inevitably intersected with the road he abandoned. The constant vigilance eventually sharpened into a low-grade, perpetual hum of awareness. Brian had adapted to the rhythm of the periphery, where information traveled through hushed whispers in greasy diners and fleeting glances exchanged across crowded, illegal betting rings. He learned that trust in this world was transactional, fragile, and heavily guarded, far different from the ingrained, almost naive faith he had placed in the badge. He started viewing every interaction, every offered job, as a potential trap set by his old colleagues. A net closing slowly around the fringes of the car culture. His hands, once meticulously clean for fingerprint dusting, were now permanently etched with carbon and oil, a topographical map of his descent. This physical change was oddly grounding. He could no longer convincingly portray the clean-cut federal agent. When he looked in the mirror, he saw not a conflicted operative, but a master mechanic with haunted eyes, someone who knew too much about how things break and how they can be forcefully put back together. The deeper he sank into this world, the more he recognized the subtle, almost spiritual connection Dom fostered. Dom's family was bound not by paperwork or shared lineage, but by a mutual understanding of marginalization. They were all outsiders who had built their own fortress of belonging. Brian's betrayal hadn't just been a personal slight to Dom. It was an attack on the very architecture of that fortress. This understanding fueled a quiet, simmering resentment toward the bureaucracy he had once served, which seemed capable of destroying genuine bonds in the name of abstract law enforcement. One rainy Tuesday, while sourcing a specialized turbocharger across state lines, a task that required navigating both legitimate vendors and shady intermediaries, Brian intercepted a fragmented piece of intelligence. It wasn't aimed at him, but at a known associate of Dom's from months prior. The information suggested that the heat wasn't entirely off. A determined faction within the LAPD, perhaps the residual anger of a failed sting, was still applying pressure, albeit more quietly, focusing on dismantling the periphery operations that kept Dom supplied and hidden. This news didn't trigger a panicked flight. Instead, it solidified Brian's resolve. He couldn't go back, But he also couldn't stand by while the consequences of his actions indirectly endangered the only people who had ever truly seen him. He made a calculated risk. He used his old network access, ghost account he thought long dormant, to plant a series of expertly crafted dead ends, diverting the focus of the residual investigation onto a completely unrelated, high-profile smuggling ring operating 3 states away. It was a dangerous move, utilizing the very tools of his former trade to shield the people who now represented everything he'd sacrificed his career for. As the smoke cleared and the digital trail vanished, Brian felt a grim satisfaction. He was finally using his unique position to actively protect, not just react, solidifying his new complicated identity as the unseen guardian of the outlaw family. The act of compromising his old system, even to protect his new allegiances, sent a sharp jolt of adrenaline through Brian, a cleaner, colder rush than any street race had ever provided. It was the thrill of perfect execution against a system he knew intimately, a chess master moving pieces on a board only he could fully visualize. He closed the secure line, wiping the interface clean with deliberate, almost ritualistic movements. He hadn't just deflected the investigation. He had sent it crashing into an entirely different criminal ecosystem, forcing his former colleagues to fight a battle on ground chosen by him. This tactical subterfuge confirmed his evolving skill set. Brian O'Connor was no longer just a good driver or a competent agent. He was becoming an architect of evasion, a ghost in the machine of federal law enforcement. The inherent irony wasn't lost on him. He was using the discipline of the academy to facilitate the very chaos he had been trained to eradicate. This cognitive dissonance was the constant background noise of his existence, a low thrumming pressure that kept him sharp. He thought of Mia again, not with longing for the past, but with a fierce, protective calculation for her future. If the periphery was heating up, she and Dom would need warning. He couldn't contact them directly, but he knew the channels, the anonymous drops, the dead letterboxes utilized by those who existed outside the grid. He began formulating a message, not written in words, but coded into the specifications of a high-end engine part ordered, and then mysteriously lost in transit to a known associate of theirs, a small, precise piece of engineering that only Dom would recognize as a signal of impending danger. The weight of the secret pressed down, heavier than any legal burden. He carried the knowledge that he was actively working against the agency that once housed his aspirations. He missed the validation, the clear-cut morality of right and wrong, but he understood that morality wasn't absolute. Sometimes it was contextual, defined by who you chose to stand beside when the chassis began to twist under pressure. As dusk settled, casting long skeletal shadows across the industrial yard, Brian started work on his own ride, a stripped-down, heavily modified import that was becoming less a car and more a weaponized extension of his will. He didn't need the muscle of Dom's charger. He needed agility, near invisibility, and the ability to execute surgical maneuvers. He tightened a bolt, the metallic snick sounding definitive, the quiet hanger. He was forging his own path, a solitary, high-risk endeavor where the only reward was the chance to keep the few threads of genuine connection he'd woven intact, operating in the dark so that others, his chosen family, could stay running in the light. He was the guardian they never knew they had, and the loneliness of that necessary disguise was a small price for the fierce, illicit sense of belonging he felt in protecting their freedom. The isolation, initially a necessary cocoon, began to manifest as a gnawing deficiency. Brian realized that while he could expertly manage the mechanics of evasion, the untraceable transactions, the clean escapes, the encrypted communication, he was failing at the mechanics of human connection. Dom's world thrived on shared vulnerability. Brian's world was now defined by its necessary suppression. He was an island of hypercompetence in a sea of necessary distrust. He found himself gravitating towards the quiet moments that punctuated the chaos. He'd watch the late-night construction workers, the early morning truckers, observing the mundane routines of those who still lived within the boundaries of the known world. He envied their simplicity, the luxury of predictable commitments. His own commitment was to an absent figure and a volatile situation. He had traded the structure of the badge for the structure of the debt, and both demanded an absolute toll. The coded message regarding the renewed scrutiny was deployed, sent out into the network like a silent sonar ping. Now Brian waited, not for an answer, but for a reaction, a subtle shift in the local chatter, a change in vehicle patterns. This waiting was the hardest part, stripping him bare of action, forcing him to confront the quiet man beneath the adrenaline junkie persona. He replayed his relationship with Mia, realizing her trust had been the one thing he hadn't had to earn through mechanical prowess or shared risk. It had been freely given, and he had shattered it with the precision of a poorly calculated trajectory. This realization brought a new focus to his mechanical work. He began building systems not just for escape, but for communication, redundant analog systems that could survive a digital sweep. He created specialized, near-indestructible storage units disguised within common engine blocks, perfectly engineered to hold critical intelligence should he ever need to pass it on. He was preparing contingencies for a future where his direct involvement might become necessary, a calculated readiness to step out of the shadows if the danger reached a critical threshold. He was no longer just running from the LAPD, he was running for the Toretto ethos, the inherent right of people to self-determine their lives outside the official narrative. He saw his actions as a form of prolonged penance, a continuous act of counterbalancing his original deception. As he leaned over the engine bay of his modified car, the metal cool against his forehead, Brian O'Connor understood his new reality. He was the phantom guardian, the ghost in the machine, forever orbiting the family he chose to save, ensuring their path remained clear even if his own destiny was irrevocably marked by the dust of the road he left behind. The silence now wasn't just deafening, it was loaded, filled with the silent promise of future, necessary intervention. The air in Brian's clandestine garage, a rented, forgotten corner of a defunct auto warehouse, carried the weight of his vigilance. The engine he was currently tuning, a beast of polished aluminum and meticulously clean wiring, hummed at a near-silent idle. A testament to control Brian desperately sought in his personal life. He treated every component with a reverence he had once reserved for his oath. Every torque setting, every fuel mixture adjustment, was a small victory against the entropy he felt creeping into his soul. He was no longer just masking the flaws of the machines. He was perfecting them as instruments of survival. His face, once open and eager, was now etched with perpetual alertness. There were faint lines around his eyes that hadn't been there 6 months ago, the telltale signs of someone who slept lightly, trained to register the slightest change in ambient noise, a distant siren, an unfamiliar engine note, the snap of a twig under a heavy boot. He had mastered the art of looking utterly unremarkable, the perfect urban camouflage. Competent enough to be trusted by the underworld, bland enough to be dismissed by the law. The coded message, tucked away in the lost turbo shipment, felt like a hollow victory. It was necessary, yes, but it lacked the visceral satisfaction of a direct confrontation, the kind that involved the smell of burning rubber and the shared electric fear with Dom. Brian craved that shared experience, the proof of mutual reliance that transcended mere technical assistance. He missed the casual, almost aggressive camaraderie of the Toretto crew, the way they leaned on each other without having to articulate the burden. He often replayed a specific moment with Mia, a rainy afternoon in the garage where she'd handed him a wrench, their fingers brushing. It was a fleeting touch, yet it carried the weight of genuine acceptance, an affirmation that existed outside the parameters of his undercover assignment. That memory was both a comfort and a torment, a constant reminder that he had thrown away the only chance at a real life he'd ever been offered. He couldn't approach her now. The contamination of his identity was too great. To reach out would be to pull her, forcibly, into the moral gray zone he now occupied, and Brian lacked the self-absorption to inflict that on her. His actions were becoming bolder, yet more precise. He wasn't just avoiding detection, he was actively sculpting the flow of information around Dom's former haunts. He was laying digital tripwires for investigators, creating false leads that would consume weeks of departmental resources. This intricate phantom warfare was exhausting, but it was the only way Brian could express his loyalty, not as a cop, but as a skilled adversary. He was fighting on the inside, using the blueprints of the system against itself. He knew that one day, the cost of this vigilance would become too high. that the path of the lone protector might lead him directly into the crosshairs he was trying so hard to keep clear for others. But for now, the low thrum of his perfected engine was the only lullaby he needed, the sound of a life lived intensely, if unjustly, outside the lines. The Fast and the Furious, in its raw 2001 iteration, serves as a surprisingly foundational text for a franchise that would eventually orbit the stratosphere of blockbuster cinema. Far from the globe-trotting espionage and improbable physics that came to define its later installments, this initial foray into the neon-drenched, testosterone-fueled underbelly of Los Angeles street racing feels grounded, almost anthropological, in its depiction of subculture. It is less about saving the world and more about the delicate balance between adrenaline, community, and illegality. The central conflict hinges on the internal struggle of Brian O'Connor, portrayed by Paul Walker in a career-defining early role. Walker, already establishing himself as a charming presence capable of handling both action and dramatic vulnerability, evident in films like Pleasantville, is cast here as the undercover operative infiltrating the world of Dominic Toretto. Brian is the ultimate outsider, attempting to gain entry, driven not purely by duty, but by an undeniable, almost romantic pull toward the freedom that Toretto's crew embodies. This duality, the cop who secretly yearns for the life he is supposed to destroy, provides the essential dramatic engine. Vin Diesel's Dominic Toretto is the gravitational center, a figure carved out of granite and obsession. Diesel at this stage was emerging from roles that hinted at his commanding screen presence, notably his critically acclaimed turn in Pitch Black. Here, that intensity is channeled into a fierce loyalty to his makeshift family and an almost spiritual connection to the machinery of his Dodge Charger. Dom is not merely a criminal, he is a patriarch operating under his own strict code of honor, a code learned through hardship and the constant shadow of incarceration. His philosophy, often delivered in clipped, profound statements, contrasts sharply with the polished, procedural world Brian comes from. The film excels in establishing the culture of illegal street racing. It's a world where the vehicle is an extension of the self, where financial stakes are high, but the currency of respect is even higher. The technical jargon, NOS boosts, precise shifting, finding the perfect launch, isn't just flavor, it's the language of belonging. Director Rob Cohen skillfully visualizes this energy. The editing during the races is frenetic yet clear, allowing the audience to feel the visceral impact of speed without becoming entirely disoriented. The influence of early 1990s urban cinema, particularly films dealing with fast cars and marginalized communities, is palpable, yet The Fast and the Furious injects a contemporary sheen. The romantic subplot involving Brian and Mia Toretto, Dom's sister played by Jordana Brewster, serves as the primary mechanism for Brian's assimilation. Mia acts as the bridge, the sympathetic character who recognizes the good in both worlds. Her affection for Brian forces him to confront the ethical compromises of his investigation, blurring the lines between his badge and his burgeoning loyalty to Dom. The film's greatest achievement, beyond the thrilling set pieces involving vehicular mayhem, is its successful articulation of the concept of found family. For Dom and his crew, this is not just about a shared hobby. It is survival. They are united by economic necessity and a shared sense of exclusion from mainstream society. When Dom quotes his father about always having someone to watch your back, it lands with genuine weight because the audience has seen the dangers they face together. Ultimately, The Fast and the Furious is an origin story in the most literal sense. It establishes the archetypes, the conflicted lawman, the unwavering leader, the devoted mechanics, the necessary romantic anchor, that the subsequent sequels would amplify to operatic scales. It functions as a gritty, low-to-the-ground exploration of masculinity, speed, and loyalty, proving that even a story rooted in importuner culture could possess enough human drama to launch a global phenomenon. The ending, where Brian makes the conscious choice to let Dom escape, is the true moment of transformation, the moment the cop dies and the believer is born. The emotional texture of this debut is markedly different from the spectacle that followed. It is steeped in a certain late 90s, early aughts melancholy, a feeling of living intensely within a narrow, self-defined boundary just outside the law. Brian O'Connor's gradual shedding of his FBI persona is almost palpable. We see it in the way he starts favoring Toretto's understated functional attire over his crisp law enforcement wear, and in the deepening sincerity of his gaze when talking about engine mechanics rather than surveillance reports. Paul Walker embodied a specific type of accessible, slightly lost American masculinity. The guy you could root for because his ambition seemed less about career advancement and more about finding a place where he genuinely belonged. His eventual betrayal of his badge isn't just a plot point. It's a surrender to an authentic emotional connection he couldn't find within the rigid structure of his career. Contrast this with Dominic Toretto's ironclad certainty. Diesel plays Dom not as a flashy villain, but as a man carrying the weight of past trauma, specifically the pivotal unaddressed death of his father, which informs every decision he makes regarding loyalty. His obsession with the Charger isn't just about speed. It's a tangible link to his lineage and a defiant assertion of control over his own destiny, something society repeatedly threatened to strip from him. When Dom speaks, the dialogue carries the resonance of scripture within his circle. His philosophy is entirely situational, built on immediate trust and absolute accountability. He doesn't operate on abstract legal concepts. He operates on favors owed and debts paid in full, often with personal risk. This inherent moral ambiguity, which keeps Brian perpetually off balance, is the core tension that makes their eventual brotherhood so compelling. The supporting cast, though thinly sketched by later franchise standards, serves their essential narrative functions perfectly. Characters like Vince and Jesse are vital cogs in illustrating the precariousness of this lifestyle. Vince, played by Matt Schulze, embodies the suspicious gatekeeping aspect of the crew, the one who trusts no outsiders, and acts as the immediate physical antagonist to Brian's presence. Jesse, the younger tech-savvy tuner, represents the pure, unadulterated joy of the culture, the passion for the craft, untainted by leadership burdens. His ultimate fate is the necessary, tragic reminder of the external threat posed by the police and rival gangs, reinforcing why Dom's protective instinct is so fierce. Visually, the film is a celebration of specific Los Angeles geography, the drive-ins, the endless stretches of highway lit by the sickly glow of aftermarket lights, and the garages where wrenching becomes a form of meditation. The cinematography bathes these scenes in shadow and vibrant color flares from neon, creating a heightened reality where the cars themselves become the main characters, their chrome and matte finishes reflecting the aspirations and anxieties of their drivers. The music selection, heavily leaning on nu metal and early 2000s hip-hop, functions as the soundtrack of aspiration, a soundscape promising dominance and escape. What elevates The Fast and the Furious above being a simple cops and robbers flick is this persistent emphasis on performance as identity. In the world of street racing, you are what you drive, and how you drive defines your word. Brian must perform the role of the street racer flawlessly to survive undercover, but in doing so, he accidentally perfects the role of the friend, blurring the line between required deception and genuine feeling. The film's lasting power, even before the sequels turned it into a global action property, lies in its successful construction of a potent, if dangerous, sense of belonging in a fragmented modern landscape. The very air of this original film is thick with the smell of hot asphalt and high-octane fuel, a sensory immersion that the later, more sterile action set pieces could never quite replicate. This initial LA backdrop is crucial. It is a world defined by limited means achieving maximum flash. The modifications on the cars, the spoilers, the underglow kits, the custom paint jobs, are not mere accessories. They are declarations of independence, tangible proof that these young men and women have taken control of their immediate environment, when the larger economic and social structures have left them behind. Mia Toretto, played by Jordana Brewster, is the emotional barometer of the story. She possesses a quiet resilience, functioning as the conscience of the Toretto household. Her attraction to Brian is rooted in seeing past the facade. She recognizes the inherent decency buried beneath his FBI handler's performance. Brewster brings an understated earnestness to Mia, making her investment in Brian's potential for redemption believable. She is the anchor that prevents Brian from completely dissolving into the role he is playing, constantly offering him a pathway back to legitimate life, even as she is drawn deeper into Dom's orbit herself. The crew's dynamic is built on a fragile ecosystem of trust. Consider the palpable suspicion radiating off Vince. He represents the old guard, the fiercely protective instinct that views any newcomer, especially one as clean-cut as Brian, as a potential vulnerability to their delicate arrangement with the law. Vince's jealousy and distrust are not cartoonish. They stem from a real fear that Brian's presence will jeopardize the hard-won stability Dom has forged for them. This internal friction highlights that Dom's leadership is constantly being tested, not just by external pressures like the police or rival racers like Johnny Strong's character, but by the very people sworn to protect him. The training montage sequences, where Dom schools Brian in the proper technique, the shifting, the controlled aggression, are less about driving instructions and more about indoctrination. Dom is mentoring a disciple, not just training an asset. The slow motion shots of hands gripping the wheel, the focused intensity in Brian's eyes as he finally masters a complex maneuver, signify his psychological transition. He stops mimicking the racer and begins to inhabit the ethos. When Brian successfully earns Dom's respect by taking the wheel of the Supra during the climactic heist sequence, it's a payoff built on earned trust, not just successful infiltration. The film's climax, the semi-truck hijack, is engineered not just for spectacular vehicular stunts, but to force Brian's final allegiance test. He has the evidence, he has the mandate from his superiors. Yet watching Dom execute a near-suicidal maneuver to secure the load proves to Brian that Dom's adherence to his own code is absolute. This act of selflessness within illegality is the final persuasive argument. Brian's decision to hand over the keys and walk away at the close isn't a failure of police work. It's a successful act of human connection, valuing loyalty over jurisprudence. It's the quiet understanding between two men who have shared life-threatening moments, a bond forged under the relentless high beams of the L Night that ultimately defines the franchise's enduring, if ethically complicated, heart. The very structure of this narrative, in its intentional focus on localized conflict and personal stakes, sets the stage for the franchise's eventual, almost paradoxical evolution toward global heroism. The Fast and the Furious operates on a principle of immediate consequence. A stolen DVD player shipment has more immediate weight than any geopolitical threat. This small-scale criminality roots the characters in relatable, though unlawful, economic reality. They are not super spies. They are skilled laborers hustling in the margins, their ambition confined to upgrading their vehicles and avoiding jail time. This contrast between the low stakes of the initial premise and the eventual necessity of world-saving missions forms the franchise's most fascinating trajectory. The foundation laid here, the emphasis on technical skill, the deep-seated loyalty to the family unit, and the inherent distrust of outside authority, becomes the moral framework upon which impossible feats are later justified. Dom's philosophy, "It doesn't matter if you win by an inch or a mile," is initially applied to a drag race, but it later morphs into the justification for preventing nuclear catastrophe. The initial commitment to brotherhood provides the emotional anchor that makes the increasingly absurd action sequences plausible to the audience because we believe in the personal ties binding the characters. Furthermore, the film subtly critiques the very system Brian represents. The FBI agents are portrayed as detached, bureaucratic, and ultimately inept at understanding the cultural landscape they are trying to police. They view the street racers as simple criminals to be processed, failing to recognize the community, skill, and honor that exists within that world. Brian's success is not achieved through superior police work, but through successful cultural assimilation. He learns the language, respects the rituals, and, crucially, demonstrates the requisite courage in a crisis. The system he represents ultimately fails him because it cannot offer him the sense of purpose or the profound belonging that Dom's flawed family unit provides. The blue uniform is discarded for a deeper, unspoken allegiance to the people who have seen him at his most vulnerable behind the wheel. This initial narrative conclusion, the embrace of the outlaw over the officer, is the essential ideological cornerstone that every subsequent film must either adhere to or actively subvert, though usually to reaffirm the primacy of the Toretto clan. The foundational tension that makes this first installment so compelling stems directly from the inherent romanticism attached to rebellion and mechanical mastery in early 2000s youth culture. The film taps into a zeitgeist where personal customization, the highly tuned engine, the signature paint scheme, was the ultimate form of self-expression against the backdrop of consumerist uniformity. For these characters, the garages and the starting lines are sanctuaries. They are places where meritocracy, albeit an illegal one, reigns supreme. If your timing is off by a fraction of a second, or if your modifications fail, the consequences are immediate and personal, unlike the vague, distant threats often faced by those in legitimate white-collar professions. This intense focus on tangible skill is what elevates characters like Jesse beyond mere set dressing. Jesse's expertise in sourcing components and tuning engines represents the pure, uncorrupted passion of the culture, the love of the machine, divorced from the leadership burden that weighs on Dom. His earnest desire to impress, to show off his newly acquired, coveted components, is tragically naive in the face of the ruthlessness outside their bubble. His death, catalyzed by a simple misunderstanding involving money owed to an outside party, a consequence of their criminal enterprise bleeding into other spheres, serves as the brutal education for Brian and the cementing of Dom's fierce isolationism. It solidifies the understanding that the perimeter of their loyalty must be absolute. Otherwise, the outside world will consume the weakest link. Moreover, the film excels in establishing the visual grammar of speed as a substitute for emotional connection. In a world where overt displays of affection might be seen as weakness, the synchronized movements of a successful high-speed maneuver, the perfect handoff during the truck heist, the seamless merging of cars after a drop, become the highest form of nonverbal intimacy. Brian gains acceptance not by reciting his cover story, but by performing flawlessly alongside Dom. He proves his worth not with words, but with horsepower and nerve. This visceral, action-based communication system explains why the relationships in the franchise feel so unbreakable later on. They are forged in shared adrenaline and near-death experiences, far deeper than the casual friendships found in conventional settings. The early film understands that in high-stakes environments, trust is earned in moments, not years. The enduring legacy of this inaugural film rests heavily on its effective portrayal of the code. Dominic Toretto is the living embodiment of this internal legal system, one that prioritizes kinship above all else. This code is not abstract. It is tangible, written in the loyalty demonstrated when Dom risks his freedom to protect Brian after the latter crashes his undercover vehicle, or when he violently confronts Vince for threatening Brian prematurely. Diesel imbues Dom with an almost religious fervor for this structure. His worldview suggests that society's laws are inherently flawed or, worse, rigged against those who start with nothing. His commitment to his family, Mia, Brian, eventually, and the mechanics is a conscious rejection of the nuclear family model that societal norms prescribe, offering instead a voluntary, chosen allegiance based on mutual survival and respect. Brian O'Connor's arc is the audience's entry point into this zealous world, and Walker expertly navigates the fine line between performance and genuine internal shift. Initially, Brian's fascination with Dom is academic, driven by the thrill of the investigation. However, as he witnesses the raw, unvarnished loyalty within the crew, particularly during the tense moments when their illegal activities are threatened, his professional detachment erodes. The scene where Brian tests his newly acquired driving skills, not for the FBI, but to earn Dom's nod of approval, is where the transformation crystallizes. He begins to speak the language of the street, not just to deceive, but because he is starting to feel it internally. The moment he chooses to let Dom go, driving off into the desert sunset with the Charger, signifies the ultimate adoption of the code over the oath. It is an act of supreme moral rebellion against the system that molded him, choosing the immediate, felt connection of brotherhood over abstract justice. This personal sacrifice secures the franchise's central, unshakable premise. Family, however defined, always comes first. The aesthetic of the film, characterized by its saturated blues, sharp yellows of the nitrous oxide bursts, and the constant visual emphasis on highly polished, personalized machinery, defines the specific cultural moment of the early 2000s tuner scene. This visual language is inseparable from the characters' identities. The cars are not mere transportation, they are mobile extensions of ego and aspiration, representing a democratization of power. In a world where economic mobility might be restricted, the ability to customize and dominate the asphalt offers an immediate, visible form of social currency. The precise mechanics and specialized tools seen in the garage scenes underscore that this mastery requires dedication and discipline. Mirroring the dedication required in any skilled trade, only applied here, outside the bounds of legality. The quiet intensity of Michelle Rodriguez's character, Letty Ortiz, while underdeveloped in this first outing, serves as an essential counterbalance to Mia's emotional openness. Letty is defined by her taciturn toughness and unwavering dedication to Dom, representing the fiercely protective, almost feral aspect of the chosen family. Her presence reinforces that membership in this group requires resilience and a certain hard-won cynicism regarding the outside world. She doesn't offer soft counsel, she offers solidarity in conflict. Her brief but impactful screen time establishes a pattern for the strong, often silent female figures in the franchise who derive their strength and purpose directly from their commitment to the Toretto Circle. The film's pacing, deliberately slower than its successors, allows for extended sequences focused purely on atmosphere and character interaction outside of action set pieces. These moments, the quiet dinners, the casual banter in the driveways, are vital because they build the audience's investment in the relationships that the later high-octane sequences will depend on. We need to believe in the depth of Dom and Brian's burgeoning bond before we can accept Brian's ultimate betrayal of his badge. It is this slow burn of earned trust, built over shared beers and under the hood of a V8 engine, that grants the film its emotional authenticity, making the final act of clemency feel like a necessary human conclusion rather than a procedural oversight. This grounded realism ensures that the stakes, while initially revolving around truck theft, are fundamentally about personal integrity and the definition of one's true allegiance. The initial decision by Brian to release Dom is more than just a narrative concession. It is the true establishment of the franchise's moral compass. By choosing to sever ties with his career trajectory and effectively become an accomplice, Brian embraces the romantic ideal of the outlaw, a figure defined by personal integrity rather than institutional mandate. This choice is predicated on witnessing Dom's unwavering commitment to his own people, an ethic that Brian finds far more compelling than the abstract goals of law enforcement, which ultimately seem ill-equipped to understand or appreciate the nuances of this subculture. It's a rejection of the rigid, hierarchical structure of the FBI in favor of the fluid, earned respect found on the streets. This act of emancipation sets the stage for Brian's subsequent, often reluctant, integration into the family fold across the early films. He enters the Toretto world not as a perfect prodigy, but as an outsider seeking redemption through participation. Paul Walker's continued portrayal of Brian emphasizes this tension. He is always slightly too clean, too self-aware, perpetually straddling the line between the adrenaline rush of the street and the nagging obligation to his past life. This internal push and pull provides a necessary counterweight to Dom's unyielding certainty, ensuring that the protagonist remains relatable even as the circumstances around him become increasingly extreme. He is the outsider who genuinely tries to belong, a humanizing element amidst the machismo and the machinery. The underlying theme of performance versus reality permeates every interaction. The street races are literal showcases where identity is tested in real time. The speed and precision, are the only accepted measures of a person's worth. Johnny Strong's character, Leon, serves as a minor cautionary figure, a member of the crew who seems slightly less defined by Dom's code and more by the immediate thrill. The film subtly implies that survival in this environment requires not just driving skill, but a complete immersion in the shared mythology. When Brian slips up, when his cover is nearly blown, it is not because he misjudged a turn, but because he failed to adequately perform the expected role of the loyal insider. The danger, ultimately, is always rooted in deception and the risk of exposure to the system they both simultaneously crave and fear. The thematic resonance of The Fast and the Furious is deeply rooted in the American mythology of self-invention, albeit filtered through the highly specific lens of tuner car culture. Dom Toretto is the embodiment of the self-made man, his authority derived not from inheritance or formal credentials, but from sheer force of will and the demonstrable ability to protect those under his banner. Vin Diesel's physical presence commands attention, suggesting a man who has had to fight for every inch of respect he commands. His garage, his sanctuary, is less a place of business and more a monastery where the rituals of engine building offer spiritual solace. He is the modern-day frontiersman, carving out a territory where his own rules apply, the constant threat of police intervention serving as the wilderness he must perpetually outmaneuver. This environment necessitates absolute trust, which is why the infiltration by Brian is such a profound violation. The film's tension escalates not when the police are close to catching them running races, but when Dom begins to treat Brian as a true confidant. The scene where Dom shows Brian the Charger, the monument to his father's tragic end, is an act of extraordinary vulnerability, an offering of his deepest pain and source of motivation. For Brian, this is the moment the mission shifts from observation to immersion. He's being let into the inner sanctum of Dom's identity, and to maintain the facade means accepting that identity as his own, at least temporarily. The role of Mia in mediating this relationship cannot be overstated. Jordana Brewster plays Mia not as a prize to be won, but as the quiet conscience aware of the inherent risk in Dom's all-or-nothing lifestyle. Her affection for Brian is an implicit plea for him to choose a path that allows for connection without constant danger. She understands the allure of speed and freedom, but also recognizes the fragility of a life lived entirely outside the law. Her presence ensures that the conflict is not purely external, cop versus criminal, but intensely internal, duty versus desire, structure versus belonging. In essence, the film uses the high-stakes world of illegal street racing as a crucible to test the very nature of loyalty. The spectacle of speed and the allure of customized machinery are merely the attractive packaging for a very simple, very human story. Finding your tribe. When Brian lets Dom walk free, he is not just saving a friend. He is endorsing an alternative social contract, one based on unwavering personal allegiance rather than abstract governmental authority. This decision is the emotional climax, providing the necessary foundation for the franchise to later justify its expansion into globe-trotting adventures. Because if family is the ultimate authority, then protecting them supersedes any jurisdictional boundary. The gritty realism of the 2001 film owes much to its commitment to depicting the mechanics of hustling. These characters aren't afforded the luxury of limitless resources. Every modification, every nitrous boost, is a calculated risk, often financed through the very heists they conduct. This economic necessity sharpens the stakes considerably. The tension surrounding the stolen DVD players is not just about avoiding arrest, it's about maintaining the fragile capital required to keep their highly specialized vehicles running and their small empire afloat. This emphasis on tangible, small-scale enterprise contrasts sharply with the later multi-billion-dollar plots, grounding the original in a relatable, if illegal, form of blue-collar ambition. The crew's internal hierarchy is fiercely defended by those closest to Dom. Vince, in particular, acts as a vital early antagonist to Brian precisely because he is so deeply invested in the integrity of the Toretto structure. Vince views Brian's easy charm and polished appearance with immediate hostility, sensing a threat not just to the investigation, but to the delicate balance of power that Dom maintains. His suspicion is a direct reflection of Dom's own guarded nature. Both understand that vulnerability can be fatal in their line of work. This friction showcases that Dom's leadership is maintained not just through charisma, but through an almost constant enforcement of boundaries. Furthermore, the visual language developed here establishes the contrast between the two worlds in a subtle, stylistic manner. Brian's early attempts to blend in often involve ill-fitting attire or an overcompensation in behavior, highlighting the fundamental difference between the institutional precision he knows and the raw, instinctive performance required of a street racer. When he finally sheds the veneer, when he races with true instinct rather than calculated adherence to a plan, it's a moment of genuine liberation mirrored by the audience. The neon reflections off the wet pavement during their late-night drives are visual metaphors for their transient existence. Fleeting moments of intense brilliance existing only under the cover of darkness. This commitment to atmosphere over pure spectacle is what gives the film its lasting, almost nostalgic, cult status among fans who prefer the grounded intensity of the original hustle to the physics-defying exploits of the later installments. The quiet moments of shared mechanical labor, the unspoken understanding between Brian and Dom while working on an engine, speak louder than any explosion about their evolving bond. The narrative functions effectively as a modern Western, albeit one set on asphalt rather than dusty plains. Dominic Toretto is the enigmatic, morally ambiguous landowner who commands fierce loyalty through reputation and self-imposed law. Brian O'Connor is the stranger who rides into town, initially posing as an admirer, but whose true allegiance is unclear until the final confrontation. Paul Walker's performance hinges on conveying this internal negotiation, the struggle between the structured order he represents and the intoxicating immediate justice of Dom's world. His physical transformation parallels his psychological one. He sheds the corporate look for the more utilitarian, battle-ready gear of the crew, signaling a shift in allegiance from abstract law to concrete relationships. The film excels in making the specialized language of tuning and racing feel like a barrier to entry, a secret society's dialect. When Dom critiques Brian's driving or mechanical knowledge, he is not just correcting technique, he is vetting his soul. True belonging requires understanding not just the how, but the why. The cultural reverence for the machine. This reverence explains the emotional weight carried by the Charger. It is a relic of past trauma and a promise of future defiance against limitations. Diesel plays this reverence with an almost stoic melancholy, suggesting a man constantly bracing for the next blow from a system he views as inherently biased against him. The supporting roles, though serving clear archetypes, deepen the sense of community being observed. Characters like Vince embody the raw, untamed suspicion necessary for survival in this environment. His aggression towards Brian is a litmus test for the group's cohesion. Similarly, the brief but intense scenes featuring the rivalry with other racing crews serve to highlight that while Dom operates under his own code, he is not exempt from the territorial violence inherent in outlaw culture. The film makes clear that the high-speed chases are merely punctuation marks in a much deeper story about belonging and the search for a stable, albeit illicit, home base. The initial $10,000 score from the initial heist isn't just cash. It's the seed money for their communal survival, emphasizing their dependence on each other for economic viability. The ultimate success of the Fast and the Furious lies in its ability to elevate simple street racing into a near-mythological trial by fire. The races themselves are meticulously staged events, not merely showcases of vehicle power, but moments of public self-definition where reputation is forged and destroyed. The sheer audacity of the stunts, the daring maneuvers across crowded intersections, or the high-stakes midnight drags reflect from the characters' intense, focused expressions. There is an almost religious fervor to the ritual of the pre-race stare-down, the revving engines acting as invocations, and the final burnout marking the start of their communion with pure velocity. This theatricality is essential because it provides the emotional outlet for characters who are otherwise deeply guarded. Dom, for instance, rarely speaks of his feelings except through the language of the car. A perfectly tuned engine is his controlled anger. A flawlessly executed race is his assertion of control. Brian, observing this, understands that to gain trust, he must participate in the spectacle, not just witness it. His eventual mastery of the Supra during the climactic hijacking sequence is the narrative peak of his assimilation. It's a moment where his professional training converges with the raw, intuitive feeling Dom has taught him to embrace. He stops thinking like an agent and starts driving like a Toretto. The narrative expertly weaves in the consequences of this lifestyle, most tragically embodied by Jesse. Jesse's fate is the brutal reality check against the intoxicating romance of speed. He represents the dreamer who got too close to the flame of outside danger, his youthful exuberance leading him to cross an unseen boundary. His death forces both Brian and Dom to confront the fragility of their isolated world. For Dom, it is a catastrophic failure of his protective duty. For Brian, it is the final, undeniable proof that the system he left behind is less dangerous than the real-world predators circling the perimeter of Dom's family. This shared trauma solidifies their bond far more effectively than any friendly gesture ever could, transforming their nascent friendship into a binding pact forged in shared grief and a mutual desire for vengeance against the external threat that dared to violate their sanctuary. The visual language of the film is acutely attuned to the ephemeral nature of their victories. The glow of the undercarriage lights during night runs paints the asphalt in fleeting synthetic hues, vibrant blues, and toxic greens that disappear the moment the cars slow down. This aesthetic mirrors the characters' lives, bursts of exhilarating, highly visible excitement, followed by necessary retreats into the anonymity of the day or the quiet isolation of the garage. The focus on customization is key, every spoiler angled just so, every meticulously chosen decal is an act of resistance against the perceived blandness of mainstream consumerism. These cars are mobile canvases upon which they assert their individuality, turning mass-produced metal into unique extensions of self. This need for visible distinction fuels the professional jealousy simmering beneath the surface, particularly aimed at Brian. Vince's antagonism is rooted not just in suspicion of the FBI, but in a deeper envy of Brian's apparent ease and inherent status as an outsider who can move between worlds. Vince, who has fought tooth and nail within Dom's orbit, sees Brian as a clean-cut usurper. Rodriguez's portrayal of Letty, often standing sentinel-like near Dom, projects a protective ferocity that mirrors Vince's possessiveness, yet hers is rooted in devotion rather than insecurity. She observes Brian's infiltration with a quiet, assessing gaze, understanding that any threat to Dom's leadership is a threat to the stability of their entire constructed reality. The film's pacing allows these subtle character dynamics to breathe. The scenes inside Dom's cluttered, sentimental house, the shrine to his father, the family dinners that feel both obligatory and deeply cherished, are where the audience truly connects with the stakes. These domestic moments reveal that the danger isn't just about getting caught stealing electronics. It's about the potential dissolution of this surrogate family unit. When Brian is finally accepted enough to sit at that table, it signifies more than professional success for him. It signifies a deep emotional yearning being tentatively fulfilled. His initial cover story begins to crumble, not because of a factual error, but because the warmth and belonging he finds there are genuinely seductive, making the idea of betraying them feel like an act of profound, self-inflicted spiritual damage. The decision to let Dom go at the end is therefore not just a cop letting a suspect go. It is a man choosing his true, messy, and dangerous family over the sterile promise of his career path. The culmination of Brian's dual existence, the undercover agent maneuvering there through a world of illicit adrenaline, is expertly framed by the climax where his loyalty is forced into stark, unambiguous relief. The truck heist sequence transcends mere action choreography. It becomes a pressurized crucible, testing the very foundation of the relationships established. When the crew executes the near-impossible transfer mid-highway, the seamless coordination is a testament to the trust they have built, a trust Brian must now actively betray or honor. His calculated risk in allowing Dom the Charger, ensuring his escape, is the physical manifestation of his moral pivot. He sacrifices his badge, his potential career ascendancy, and his connection to established order for a shared moment of mutual respect under the harsh desert sky. The image of Brian standing alone, watching the roaring charger disappear, Walker's expression a complex mixture of relief, professional resignation, and nascent pride, is the definitive statement of the franchise's ideological core. He has chosen the outsider's path, aligning himself with the principle that personal bonds supersede public mandate. This ending is inherently anti-authoritarian. The system that nurtured Brian is rejected in favor of the system of the Toretto Code. It establishes a precedent that authority figures in subsequent films will always be viewed with suspicion unless they prove themselves capable of understanding, or at least respecting, the family's values. This initial sacrifice makes the subsequent reunion of Brian and Dom in later films not just convenient plot progression, but a necessity stemming from a debt of honor. Brian's choice validates Dom's entire worldview, that the chosen family is the only